Critically engaging sociopolitical content and encouraging empowerment through decolonial and holistic collaborations are key to their community work and socially engaged artist practice. Throughout their career and across continents, they have made a commitment to amplifying and supporting the lives of people with marginalized identities, specifically people and artists of the African diaspora, queer people, and people of color. Join me in welcoming this incredible group of artists and thinkers. So to start, Hannah will kick us off and share a bit about the work she chose for today, which I'm going to get to in a second, and elaborate a bit about that. So 1 second, let's show you the work. All right, kick us off.
Thank you so much, Devin. I'm so excited to be here today. I'm honored to be a part of the conversation and wrapping up Faith Ringgold's wonderful and important exhibition here at FAMSF, and I'm really excited to just briefly speak a bit about the French collection and story quilts, which are some of the most well-known, I would say, some of the most well-known works of Ringgold's as they were presented in storybooks for young children and are much more accessible as they have kind of narrative-based works around the frame. And so just kind of starting by looking at what we have in the picture here in the story quilt, which is on view upstairs, as you all should know, is we have a quilted framework almost emphasized and framed by what kind of looks like biblical allegory and its numbering and its way it's presenting kind of paragraph-based narratives. And so thinking about moving into the frame and seeing that we have, Van Gogh, who's one of the, quote unquote, a master painter, and I want to emphasize that sense of we're seeing a lot of master artists and interdisciplinary scholars and thinkers here, and lots of Black exceptionalists, folks who are doing, who are studying in, the field of classical arts, craft-based arts, and were exceptionally trained for this period these periods that we're seeing in this painting, which also takes place in Paris, in thinking about transatlantic training of artists in this period and much earlier, and thinking about when an artist is typically accepted into the art world, 18th, 19th century, it's typically through these Parisian networks, and so thinking about these Black American female artist networks and thinking about William Marie, who's a fictional character that Ringgold had created. We see her on my right. We see her being surrounded by Black American exceptionalist male thinkers. So we have folks like Jacob Lawrence, we have folks like Aaron Douglas, whose works are upstairs in the contemporary and modern galleries. We have works that present the Great Migration and histories of leaving the South to head north for more opportunities of production and artistic production and industrial training and whatnot. And so thinking about these individuals who are trained in craft in places like, or not necessarily places like Tuskegee Institute Normal, now Tuskegee University, not necessarily Whittier, but are representations of classical and craft-based Black American training in the arts that were really used for industrial education. So when we think about these masters who are, canonicized or very canonical and are in the center of the frame here, we're really thinking, or Ringgold is really thinking about the African American female artists, thinkers, even designers in a sense, as we're seeing like early Fanny Criss work, which was really discussed in, I hope folks caught the Patrick Kelly show, but one of the touchstones around Black American designers in fashion that was presented in a text chaptered by Kristen L. Stewart had to do with Fanny Criss's designs. And she was a Black American designer in the early 20th century who would create kind of these like lace and intricately adorned dresses that you're seeing kind of the third artist to the right here. She's wearing this kind of high-collared dress that was really designed for white patrons at the time. And so I think it's really interesting that we're seeing dresses from like the 90s, which is when the painting or the quilt was made, into, early 20th century. So I think it's interesting that she's paying tribute to Black designers, artist networks at the time into today, and thinking about these amalgamations of class types of making. So thinking about like fine art, thinking about craft and quilting as a means of pedagogical futurity in Black American education and Black American youth, and making these histories really accessible, I think is some of the most compelling components of the work. I did also just want to draw on the gaze here and thinking about how these women artists and thinkers and creators are looking at one another and thinking about, the attitudes of Black American women in Paris at this time, or Black Americans in Paris period at the time, and thinking about, just thinking about this concept of triple consciousness coined by, exceptional Black thinker W.E.B. Du Bois at a similar time period to when these folks were, at their peak, and thinking about triple consciousness as the extension of Black feminism. So thinking about one's race being Black in a white, primarily Eurocentric society, and then adding, or I think what would be the word? The adaptation of triple consciousness to W.B. Du Bois would be this feminism lens. So I like that these figures in the painting, these left out artists, Elizabeth Catlett, I want to make sure I don't leave anyone out, but just to name a few, Edmonia Lewis, Paul Gauguin, who we also see slightly off center. But I think that a large part of the power in the work, aside from just materiality, is this concept of the artist network and collective and ancestral continuity in teaching these types of history making and ways of knowing through craft, I think is a way of also paying tribute to forms of successful Black American education post the Civil War. So I hope I didn't go over too much, but that's, I think, some of the most captivating visuals that I'm seeing in the painting.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Mattie?
All right. Am I meant to? I would love to respond to like Hannah's description, but I will also go. I guess I'll use that as a bridge. Is that I think Faith's work is so dense, and I think that let's just juxtapose this image that I've selected, which is the French Collection Part 2, Moroccan Holiday. In comparison with the work that Hannah just presented, you think about like the density of the image and the amount of people that were in the last image towards this one, where we just have 6 known figures. The layered information that is offered with the choices of who she's including, I think, is really, really powerful. And then when we're talking about story quilts, that goes even further. So when we're talking about story quilts, the reason why they're called story quilts is not only that we have a quilt that's then painted with like a larger image that looks like a traditional canvas painting, but then the story then lies within certain panels that she chooses to write literal verbal stories. She writes out a storybook for us. And so she adds a second, as a viewer, you can take on the painting as it were, you can take on the work as it were, or you can go further and actually take on the language that she chooses to give you and offer us. So hence the story goes beyond just the visual work. And so I chose this painting for a number of reasons. One, I love the story quilts because of the layered kind of information that she chooses to offer us. My eyes are down here because we also have a presentation of the work down here, but I can look up here with us, with you all as well. And part of why I chose this work was specifically because I think this is a perfect example of how Faith offers an opportunity to not only look at one image, but then, and present one relationship, but then through her stories, she extrapolates and talks about the further ways that we can look at these relationships, right? So this specific image is, that's actually her daughter, So it's meant to be Faith in the yellow chair, and then her daughter Marlena sitting down with her, and they're discussing kind of the relationship of motherhood and child, but then they're also talking about the relationship of having a working mother, like a working artist mother and their child. And then we're looking at the four figures in the back, and the story kind of goes on and talks about what it means. I mean, it talks about a number of things. So I wrote some notes in terms of the juxtapositions that she's presenting here. And you can take them, you could deduce them as you would through just looking at it, and I'm just gonna speak them from what I see. So what I see her presenting here is not only we're looking at Black mother and then Black father, right? We're looking at motherhood in the face of fatherhood, and these aren't necessarily in opposition. These are just in reality of one another, right? So I'm gonna use the word facing because we're facing each other. Just like the audience is facing the painting, in this painting, I feel like she has these things facing one another, right? So we have motherhood facing fatherhood. What does that mean? We have Black motherhood facing fatherhood. We have Black working mother. We have working mother, working artist mother facing child. What does that mean? Then we think about, actually, when you look at this painting further, you realize that they're easels. They're not just figures. They're not actually just painted on the wall. These are easels, and she has painted these men, right? And from left to right, this is upstairs. So from left to right, we have Martin Luther King, we have Malcolm X, then we have Marcus Garvey, and we have Frederick Douglass. So four of the arguable founding fathers and Mount Rushmores of Black American history. So she's repainted this Mount Rushmore of sorts, and she's also as founding fathers of Black Americanhood, right? What does that mean when she's sitting with her daughter speaking about motherhood? And she has named these, she's given, face to these men as important in her narrative, but also and so now I will go to my small phone where I have pictures of the actual text. But she's also, then she kind of goes further in this discussion that she has with her daughter about what it means, about the experience of being a working mother and what that means, and then, in the family in general. Also, these gentlemen here were, many of them had different kind of family experiences, but what does it mean to, have the mother role versus have the father role? Have the father role of just a nuclear family, or have the father role of an entire culture of people, right? And, I give pause there because I also think about these story quilts, and I think about quilts in terms of a folkloric African-American artist, traditional artistry, right? And quilts weren't traditionally painted, right? They were sewn as they are sewn here, and then oftentimes information is sewn into those quilts. But when we take away kind of the multi-layered or the triple consciousness of Black artistic production, and specifically Black artistic folkloric production, and we're just using a quilt as something of comfort and warmth, right? If we think of it as that way, as just a piece of material that warms us. I give thanks to Faith for creating that, right? But then I also think about, okay, how is she choosing to warm us, and how is she choosing to comfort us through this quilt, through this manifestation, through this material? And she's choosing to not only sew in and not only paint in, but also write in very specific types of information. And I think that information not only comes from, it's not only facts, Malcolm X was a person, that's a fact, right? So if you left this museum, you're like, who's that second person with the blue background? Oh, that's Malcolm X. I'm learning a new fact about American history if you didn't know that before, right? But she also offers dreams, right? She offers dreams, she offers inspiration, she offers fiction, she offers non-fictions, she offers her own double realities, which you see in Les Artistes, which is the painting that Hannah presented. That is her sitting there with Van Gogh and Gauguin and Martin Luther King and all these other people alive in the flesh, but that cafe didn't happen, you know what I mean? But that's okay that it didn't happen. What she's offering is the idea that, let's think about what that reality would look like, right? And also acknowledging there was that essential reality in Paris at times with huge, not only Black American thinkers and artists and activists that would migrate to Paris, but, just acknowledging the truth and also the dream that can be mutual, at the same time. So I'm going to choose to not read the small writings, and I'm going to offer you all to go up to the painting and read them for yourselves. But this is my initial orientation to Faith's work, and one of my, that's just a speech of gratitude based off of this one painting. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Angela?
I think maybe that cafe is happening right now. My name is Angela Hennessy. Thank you, Devin, so much for the invitation. It's really lovely to be here. It's an honor to be talking about Faith Ringgold's work. It was really difficult to choose. My entry point and the work that I do is really around death and textiles, or more broadly thinking about death and art and how artists respond to grief and loss in their work, in their both aesthetic and somatic practices. And so I settled on this one, The Wake and the Resurrection of the Bicentennial Negro, 1976. And so I want to actually start with the title, because the title is really significant. It's her way of offering a critique of the bicentennial in 1976. And really, as she spoke really just so bluntly as she did, and in a way that I really appreciate, that there really wasn't anything to celebrate, and that we had been in enslavement, and because of the current conditions of the time of African Americans, that there really wasn't anything to celebrate. So she chooses to stage a funeral, right? A wake, which is a ceremonial keeping watch of the dead. So what we have here, what we're looking at are two figures. You have two figures, Bubba and Bena, who are two fictional characters that she has created a whole story about. Bubba, the husband, has died of a drug overdose, and his wife, Bena, has died right after him because of grief, because of a broken heart. So it's a double funeral, and then there's the two mourners there, which I believe is Faith and her mother. If I'm wrong, someone can correct me on that. So she's, again, putting herself and her family, her matrilineal, inheritance into the story. And one of the things that's really important to me when I start talking about looking at art and how to read, how to read art and to think about what is happening in relationship to death and grief, is to think about this horizontal and vertical, right? Because living people are usually in the vertical plane, the dead or the dying are in the horizontal plane. And that, of course, also relates to textiles, cloth, how cloth is made, right? You have weaving, you have warp and weft, you have the horizontal and the vertical. So we, can read right away that there is, that's the particular terrain that we're in. And I think the flowers here offer really, they're like really important figures, just as significant as the living and the dead folks that are being pictured there, that they're kind of in between, right? They're alive, but they're kind of like starting to lilt over, they're starting to wilt. They might be fading in color a little bit, so they represent this kind of fragility. They speak to the vulnerability also, I think, of the body, which is, something that textiles do specifically, but something that flowers do, right? We're literally watching them, die right before our eyes. So one thing, too, about this, I think, is that originally in 1976, it was also part of a performance, which, it was a performance with Aretha Franklin gospel, and there was a recitation of Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech, right? So I'm kind of hoping secretly that there's like a video of that somewhere. Like, I would really love to see that activated. And part of that activation is about, it's very specific to African American funeral practices and thinking about homegoing celebrations specifically, right? And one thing about homegoings is that they start with a very somber kind of procession, right? And then as you enter the cemetery gates, or you're, entering the kind of burial, the disposition of the body, getting to that's when everyone starts singing and dancing and wailing. The the horns are going off, and this idea is rooted in African cosmologies, excuse me, and the belief that your soul to return home, that is dependent on the way that the living commemorate you and memorialize you, right? So it's about this relationship and the responsibility that the living have towards the dead. And, over time, like this idea is about sending the soul often, all the way back to Africa, right? As enslaved people kind of celebrated, that was the orientation. So that becomes part of a way that she's, really taking on this kind of responsibility around what does it look like to grieve, what does it look like to mourn, and the necessity to do that, right? That someone else's soul, the fate of their soul is dependent on our grieving. And, all of these themes, all of the things that we've been talking about already, they're all totally relevant still today. I mean, I think that's part of the heartbreak when I look at Faith Ringgold's work is, she was clearly ahead of her time, no doubt. And that the recognition of like, she was talking about things that I talk about with my students now. She was talking about them 50 years ago. It's really a testament to who she was and to her commitment.
Thank you so much for that. That deserves a clap. So before I ask you all questions, I want to make space for you all to respond to each other and reflect on what you all have shared so far. There's been a lot to dig into here, so feel free to jump in wherever.
Remind me of the title of the painting that you were speaking about.
In short, Moroccan Holiday.
Moroccan Holiday. I was really compelled with the idea that you presented that the works were on easels, because I also wanted to emphasize that I think that some of the power in her work and the pedagogy is that she makes her process visible. In terms of painting, in terms of leaving works unfinished, you can see almost like the ground layers that she's using. And I actually think unfinishedness gets to like continuity in the work. Like these works are still, the concepts, the ideas, the historical context are ongoing. They're not over. There's no few glad that's over, because it's not this traditional form of history making that lets us think that these catastrophes and events in history are over and not ongoing. But I wanted to say I appreciate the emphasis on the easels, because I think it emphasizes that these are works in progress and they're still ongoing. And you can see like her artistic tools in the background, which I think is really intentional potentially in that. And I really appreciated that.
Well, and I think that's her like really bringing in her everyday life experience. She's not trying to remain shrouded in mystery. She's not kind of falling into those myths and stereotypes of artists, which I think also feeds into notions about mastery and these kind of iconic figures, right? And she's just showing up like, I'm a mom, I've got kids, I work at my kitchen table, like here's all my stuff. She's like laying it all out in a way that I think, makes it real, makes it tangible, and also makes it accessible. And, she's like, she's literally teaching us how to be an artist in her work, I think.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that's one of the things that I value about her and her overall legacy is that approach. None of us actually even chose any of her graphic work, like her specifically graphic design work, or, like the work of her protest. And the active protest that she made towards museums and the Whitney and that part of the work that is also equally a part of, this is one form of that same extended narrative, action, right? And I really appreciate that whole-bodied, there isn't like kind of a separation between the faiths, right? Like she is like this one, she's this one person. That painting is the same conversation of her and her daughter, who often comes to most of her, who's an active part of her real life. This isn't a fiction, although it is a fiction, a fictionalization. I really appreciate that,
And that's really, though, I think what she's doing, where she's creating, like she's creating Black families, she's creating communities, and it's really, I think it's like what Black folks do, where we create family wherever we go, and whether we're biologically connected or not. And I think especially in white spaces too, there's a recognition of like, Black people kind of sticking together. And so like when I look at those cafe scenes, that's what I see, is like I see she's making family, like everybody's all cousins, and breaking bread together, making work together. And that's just like something that we've always done. And thinking about that in the context of enslavement and slave trafficking, and the way that African Black people, Black families were intentionally, violently separated, right? The intentional dissemination and breakdown of the Black family was one of the first, well, I wouldn't say the first, it's an incredibly significant tactic of coloniality and the slave empires, right? So here she is like rebuilding and repairing Black families and bringing everyone together.
I have questions for you on that note. So you all have sort of touched on mothering or motherhood in some capacity in each of the works that you've chosen. So I want to briefly departure from that, because I kind of have a sense of where you all, or how you all are thinking about Faith's work in that regard. But one big question that came up for me as we were preparing for this conversation and thinking about these works, and I will read it because it's kind of long. But as we know, more traditional forms of self-fashioning, particularly in Renaissance portraiture, prioritize the values of the wealthy and the elite. And that, I would say that that's not happening in Faith's work exactly. But I'd be curious to hear all of you reflect on how the work utilizes self-fashioning, not as a means of dictating behavior, but as, or dictating behavior or creating sort of a normative ideal, but instead producing this sort of direct confrontation with history, and often specifically US history. Take your time.
I mean, I can start. I think I was considering this question through actually some new scholarship that's kind of come out around like using aesthetics of adornment and excess. And I appreciate, and sorry, I think this book is by Jillian Hernandez, and the text is, I don't want to like misquote it, apologies, but aesthetics of excess, art and politics of Black and Latina embodiment. And so thinking about, she is painting her characters to wear not haute couture, I would argue. Again, I haven't spoken with a fashion curator or historian on specifically what we're seeing in a lot of the works, but I would definitely argue that Faith is adorning and dressing through textiles, through not just quilts, but through fashion production as well in terms of representation. I think she's representing Black futurity, Black progress, and in this hyperbolic, over-exaggerated way with a lot of the, not necessarily the painting we're seeing, even though we are definitely seeing that they're wearing not necessarily ready to wear, meaning like it's not bought like off the rack, but also we are seeing that because there are dresses that look like they are made more contemporaneously, more centered in the frame, but just thinking about excess and how she's using excess as a form of self-liberation in terms of the concept of futurity. And I'm also really interested in the text African American Arts, Activism, Aesthetics, and Futurity. And I forget the name of the scholar who wrote about, or wrote on designing our freedom through the use of fashion. Archiving Black American fashion and designs as a mode of self-liberation. But even just thinking about, Faith's strategy is collection. Like quilt making is like collection-based. So I think it's self-liberating to take, not quote unquote fine art materials and create this new history through representation and through materiality that pushes those boundaries, I think is incredible.
I mean, do you want to go? Do you want me to go? Yeah, I mean, I think I appreciate there's a sense of like wholeness to all the way that all of her individuals are adorned or not. You know, if we think about like the slave paintings, right? Those are nudes. But there is a sense of wholeness to their figure, and I'm not talking about in stature, right? I think there's a sense of wholeness to their spirit and the way they are presented. And you know, if we think about Tar Beach and like, you know, it's a young, you know, it's a family on this, you know, working class family. Father works on the, you know, bridge, you know, on the rooftop. There isn't a sense of like disheveledness. I'm also thinking about this, the painting, and I'm going to try to pull it up, but it's the painting that's currently in this exhibition. It's at the far end across from Tar Beach, and it's slaves seeking freedom, and they're all dressed in white. But their white isn't, you know, and it's a huge group that are like kind of, yeah, on their route out, let's say. But they're not disheveled, right? They're in like whites, and it's interesting because in some spiritual practice you have your traditional whites, right? So I think there's definitely a calling to what that may mean. But everyone has a sense of dignity, both self-adorned on their face, but then also on their, like in their dress. Yeah, and I think there's a sense of wholeness. I think also even of the painting that is, it's the American flag, and it's the American flag and it's bleeding, and then there's the woman and there's the two children at the bottom of her, and it's talking about, yeah, kind of like the death of America or the pain of America and the pain of these individuals that are there pictured in this. And even in that sense of pain, there's also, even in that hurt, there is a stature, right? And it doesn't mean that because we've been through such violence, you're gonna see that violence on our clothes, right? You might see it on our clothes, but it does, you know, it doesn't penetrate our whole being in that way, right? Yeah, so I guess I appreciate the, you know, and there's also a breadth of presentations that she offers across her works. But there's always a sense of wholeness and a sense of full character, and even character that you may not even, like, there's a depth of character to all of her characters, right? Like, we know some of the story that's happening here in this, you know, Le Café des Artistes, but, like, we don't know all of it, and I think that's also a nice offering.
Well, and this is where, like, thinking about the role that textiles play, you know, becomes so important because, I mean, like, look at us. We're all wearing textiles right now. And, you know, so cloth, fabric, the clothing that we wear is, in a way, this kind of like a second skin, right? And so we read each other's bodies through cloth so often. And so that, you know, I think she's very aware of that, of like what textiles are actually doing and what they're communicating. And, you know, just like what you were saying, Mattie, you know, they may not reveal all the violence or the suffering, but yet there's a way that there's a communication that's happening, you know, through dress, through style, through pattern, right, through the fabrics, communicating lineages, right? Like there's so much that's already happening in a textile before it even gets to your body. And so that, you know, I think is something, like we're reading the textiles that she has stitched together, but then we're also reading her painting of textiles on top of that. So there's, you know, several layers and ways that, like there's a lot of information that is in each work in that way. And certainly in terms of color as well, like, you know, thinking about the role of white in African cosmology, as white is the color of the ancestors, and certain forms of divination kind of practice, you know, it's very specific as to what colors you are supposed to wear or not wear, right? So that goes both ways.
Beautiful. I did have a question that was specifically about textile as a unique form or medium for thinking about grief and violence inflicted upon or experienced by the body. And you all have sort of touched on that, but I would be curious to know if, especially you, Mattie or Hannah, if you have like additional thoughts or things to say about that particular medium as a way to think about that.
Textile in relationship to grief and self-adornment.
Yeah, both, neither?
I think that's my mind, like the current image that I have in my head is of the shroud, right? Over the, I forget what religious figure passed away, and we put a shroud over their face. But I think it's a long conversation. I think Faith deals with grief a lot in her work, actually, and grief doesn't necessarily mean the passing of an individual, but it's the grief that we deal with, let's say, as Black individuals in an American context, the grief of that violence, the grief of that experience. I think, and also there's one of her story quilts that is specifically, it's an individual, it's a young woman that is on a bridge alone, and she's in a wedding dress, and it's, I think she missed her wedding, there's some kind of catastrophe that happened that the wedding actually didn't end up happening. And there's but this is a whole fantastical dream that she's created. But I think it's the play of both the joy of the dream and the grief of the lack of reality. And it's the lack of that reality of it even being true, and then the reality of that dream that she is then created, right? There's kind of this double down experience that she's offering us to think about. This Black American woman that ran away to Paris and fell in love, and then was supposed to get married and then didn't, and is on this bridge in her fantastical wedding dress, and it's even offering the thought of that being a reality, is a special dream that who would think that would be a reality? I don't know. I think there's a lot of people that think that context couldn't be real, and so she's making it real, right? And then she's also expressing what kind of grief that would be in that experience, right? Being alone in your full wedding dress on some bridge in some country that you don't know, that you might not speak the language. I think these are all these interesting different things, and I think that is part of what I love about her work, is that she offers us these new experiences that she just creates through her imagination, that she offers that could, who says a dream isn't also reality? Because if you dreamt it and you had that experience, it is now a part of your reality, right? It may not be a part of your walking day-to-day in terms of a physical reality, but arguably, metaphysically, it still is, because you're having that waking memory. So, yeah, tangential from grief, but also included in. I think that's a nice way for her to kind of offer us to explore that.
Beautiful, thank you.
And to build on that, as someone who, I just want to situate myself in that, I do work with textiles, but in the last couple of years, I've really been working around the art historical canon and fashion history as it relates to Black American fashion and styles, and specifically that legacy of everyday fashion in the Bay Area. And so thinking a lot about, this is a textile, but it's also a repurposed material. These are repurposed materials, so I think it's going much farther beyond just a traditional textile practice. I think the concept of, or the idea of the blanket without a body underneath it hanging on a wall inherently has almost like a pile of clothing. If you have clothing laying by itself, there's been a lot of writings around that's a symbol and a marker of death when there is no body to occupy that fabric. So I think it's very interesting that you would have something that's meant to be horizontal become vertical and reclaimed in that way. And I'm very drawn to the idea of the fragmented blanket, the fragmented textile, and thinking about how textiles are being sourced and distributed in the world today. It's very different than 1994 when she was making this work, for instance. But when we think about textiles being exported to the global south now, right? And being paid to take all of our textile waste, and having to do that because it provides resources in the immediate to these Black and brown communities in the global south. I think, I don't argue that Faith was doing that at the time, but I don't think that the works are ignoring that today, in a sense. But that's how I read the embodiment, or like the performativity, is like, these are not, it's an object that's meant to be used in a sense. So I think that that's how I would read that.
Thank you. So I mentioned that I was going to choose a final artwork before we went into Q&A stuff, right? So based on the direction of this conversation, which one do you need to choose? You know what? I'm gonna leave it on this note because I love this work so much. So this is Woman on a Bridge, number 1 of 5 from the Tar Beach series. And I chose this work partially for deeply nostalgic reasons, because I remember reading Tar Beach as a child and really being impacted by that work. But also, this work has changed for me a lot over time, especially having read more about it as an adult, because I was reading an article from the National Women's Studies Association journal from like 1994. And Faith was talking about how Tar Beach actually wasn't originally conceived of as a children's book. Like, it's actually about commemorating childhood and like that particular, like the essence, capturing the essence of childhood. And what's interesting to me about that is how that can so often be lost in adulthood, like that sort of sense of innocence, but also radical potential. I think that in saying anyone can fly, which is like a really memorable line from Tar Beach, that not only speaks to, like the current moment, but it also speaks to these sort of like African mythologies of flight, of Black flight, and flying Africans escaping enslavement, as previously mentioned in this conversation. So I'd love to hear you all impromptu respond to this work a little bit.
Well, I mean, I think I also loved this book as a kid, and also still have this book in my collection as an adult. And I think part of what is special to me about this work, not only is it just beautiful and like rich in color and image, but also being a city kid and being a kid that is grown up in a predominantly concrete environment. I feel like she offers a way for those young people, whether they are young or old when they encounter this work or not, to like re-envision that and re-envision your freedom in that. Because when you grow up in a city, you often grow up also with like particularly capitalist and difficult environments, right, that you encounter. And especially as a young Black or brown child, doubled down even more so. And so I think like the concept that, we're not talking about, because there are different symbols of, economic class structure that's happening here. Why is their beach tar? We're not questioning that, right? But we're enjoying that their beach is a tar beach instead, right? Instead of their beach being sand, their beach is on their roof, right? And where their playground is in the sky, and thinking about those options and re-envisioning and reframing your reality in a way that allows you to expand instead of contract, right? And allows you to explore, and allows you to like kind of like, claim it in a way that is expansive, let's say. I think that is one of my favorite offerings from this work. Because it rings really true for a lot of people, and also thinking about like just freeing the mind of like, tar doesn't have to be a restrictive thing. Like you think like something as black as tar in terms of dark, in terms of sticky, in terms of, it's a very hard material that is not very forgiving, like a white sand beach, right? And so really making that that clear juxtaposition, but in a very imaginative and soft way, I think is like one of the really powerful beauties of this work for me.
Yeah, and it definitely takes me to that place of something I think that Black women, Black people, artists do so well, is that we really know how to make something out of almost nothing or nothing. And so when I think about like what she has done in this space of tar, I mean, some of those things you were talking about, Mattie, I think are really significant to think about the color, that it's, that it's not a white sand beach, that it's a black beach. And even, references to tar as a material, as a form of punishment too, and a form of torture, right? There's all of that history and that lineage there, and yet it becomes this space of imagination, of, looking up at the stars. I mean, something too we haven't gotten to in the conversation is just thinking about the role of text and the kind of, the way that Faith Ringgold would, bring text into the images, right? And that relationship, which, text and image is certainly something that I think it must just be essential to human development because it's something that people have been doing since, the beginning, right? And I was thinking about this with, with Egyptian art and the way that symbols and images and text come together to tell stories and communicate information. And, with a piece like this, where she's really asking us to come closer to the work, to read the story, and, even, I mean, I don't know, I'm always thinking kind of in multiple timelines of like, oh, what does this mean now? And what did this mean, 100 years ago or 200 years ago? And so when I think about, like what it means to be a Black person and to read a book, like that is not a neutral thing, in a way that's like actually a really radical act, given the history and, thinking about days when it was illegal to read, and that, could be, that could be like really a source of trouble and make problems for yourself, right? The education of enslaved people. So, all of those things really factor into that in terms of how we're reading the text with the, images, with her paintings on the quilts, but then also as a book, right? That, that was something that was so important to her, was the making of her books.
Beautifully explained. Thank you for sharing it that way. I just wanted to extend on that thought of like using, I do think that's something that's also very understudied in Faith's work, and this definitely isn't the only work that uses graphic, almost like a graphic narrative approach, I would argue, even though they are allegories and they're not, blurbed like a graphic narrative would be, but it is used in ancient forms of art and understanding and witnessing and documenting catastrophes in history. And if we think about like what the bridge is doing in terms of like this transatlantic metaphor of being in between, right? This woman who's on the bridge is not on the bridge, she's not there on the tar beach, she's not anywhere except this kind of abstract space of being in the present, being where they are, I would interpret. But I think also to then extend on Mattie's point around like it being this urban environment, I think it's also contradictory and a symbol to then have flora and fauna really primarily surrounding that picture. It speaks to the environment, but also speaks to a very lived reality in sociocultural areas that she's depicting. So I hope that answers that question.
It does, beautifully. Thank you so much. I feel like we might be, what time is it? 4:56. Oh, yeah, it's definitely question and answer time. I thought so. Sweet. So there should possibly be a mic somewhere that we can get some questions from y'all, if anyone has them. Or you can just take my mic, that's also fine. I can give you a mic, it's cool. Do you have any questions from the audience? Beautiful.
Yeah, I was wondering if it was unclear to me whether or not the portrait Invisible Woman was a self-portrait. I feel like we saw a lot of Faith envisioning herself in these works, and if I could hear you speak a little bit about that, that'd be great.
Go for it. It's upstairs, Invisible Woman. It's from the Black Light series, I believe. Yeah. And there's also an accompanying Invisible Man portrait as well, which I think is important to note.
I can't picture it.
Let me see if I have it. Do you want to give us your best? Do you want to give us your best description of what it is, or just show us real quick?
I love this sort of like audience engagement. Yes, get on stage with us.
So I believe this was Invisible Man, and then this was Invisible Woman.
Thank you for that.
So what, I forgot what the question was now.
Whether it was a self-portrait or not.
Oh.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I would argue that a lot of this work is self-portraiture, right? Like, and whether it's like literal self-portraiture or, figurative self-portraiture, because they're portraits of her. I mean, she does put her literal face in a lot of this work, because of the way that image is abstracted. I would want to ask her, right? But I also would think that she would respond saying, "This is a part of me." And maybe even Invisible Man is a part of her too, right, by extension. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, she certainly experienced invisibility in the art world. That was a motivating factor in so much of her work, and her activism was, about creating, holding institutions accountable for the exclusion of Black folks. So, I think that makes sense that, there is an aspect that, all of the work is in some way or another a self-portrait, or, certainly portraiture, which, really brings us to that question about, abstraction and, representation, or, kind of figurative representation. And those works, I mean, that whole series, is kind of like blurring those boundaries, right? And, she was certainly looking at African textiles, specifically Kupa textiles, thinking about breaking up the space. There was something I saw in one of her videos where she was talking about wanting to undermine the like top bottom sort of up down of vertical space, and so creating these like gridded spaces or triangular sections was something that was a way of doing that for her, of achieving that. But yet she still has this this face in there that's also kind of a part of that. So I think that was something that she was really conscious of doing, was kind of blurring those boundaries and thinking about what does that mean when the face is maybe receding into the background and the pattern is coming forward, or there's a lot of movement there.
And I would definitely echo what both have said, in just a sense of, I do think that there's biographical, autobiographical sensibility in all of her work, for sure. I think that's the power of using historical, like, based fiction and sentimental collected materials. I think is it inherently, I mean, the oil painting's different than what we're seeing, but I still think there's one through line between the works is the way that she's fragmented together these narratives, and that's one of the strengths in how she makes, I think, the works relatable, is aside from just using history, is she allows folks to see themselves, I would say, through the fragment. And so, like, even like that face in that portrait, I would argue it's like a fragmented portrait of not just herself, but in all honesty, I have to study the work more to speak best to it. But.
Excuse me, wasn't there something in that series to the Invisible Man, Invisible Woman that had to do with the colors of darkness? Mm-hmm. She took out all the white. Wasn't that part of that series?
Correct.
It's a really important, I thought, profound thing that when you looked at receding, but yet there's so much there. Personally, I thought that was really a profound thing about those two. Also thinking about the Invisible Man, the novel.
I also quickly want to respond to that because I think that there's that aspect, and there's also the sort of invisibilized labor and experiences of Black women that she's also working through in that work. And the sort of marginalization of Black women within even civil rights movement, that sort of thing. So that work specifically, although it is part of that larger series, Black Light, which, as you mentioned, really eliminates the color white, which is a great comment on culture, actually. But I think it's also getting at that sort of lived experience of a Black woman who is radical and how that labor is undervalued and often denigrated. So there's also that happening there. Any other questions?
Well, she was also, she was criticized whether when she painted white people and when she did not paint white people.
Right.
So.
Right.
I mean, thank you for bringing up the point about tone and color, because I think it's also that those two paintings are part of a greater series, and she does some text-based work that plays with again color and contrast, and I think it's that exact point, right, where it's it's literally it's hard to look at, right, or it's not hard to look at, but it's hard to interpret, and so hence it makes you spend time. But why is a dark thing difficult to interpret and look at? And it's almost okay, we get in terms of color theory why it might be difficult for our eyes to kind of recalibrate to see what exactly she's, is doing. But I think that act of making that kind of painting is offering the simpler question of terms of social reality, right? In terms of, okay, why is Black life and Black existence hard for people to understand or look at or, or be around or accept, all of these things, Yeah. Thanks for that.
Thank you. If we don't have any other questions, I think we're going to close out because I think we're at time, probably past time at this point, because we could talk about Faith Ringgold forever. But thank you all for joining us. Thanks to our panelists. At 5:30, we've got Melba's Kitchen performing some live jazz in Woolsey Court. There's also a free pie pop-up with Aruru Pies, so you should totally take your public programs ticket and grab free tasty things, because why not? Thank you all for joining us.
Yeah. Thank you, Devin.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.